stay separate. From there, then, we go into chapter 47, continuing on this story into chapter 47 in this study about this story of Joseph and of the family of Israel there in Egypt now. It says, now when Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are the land of Goshen. And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. And they said to Pharaoh, we have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Canaan. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your family, father, and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, let them be put in charge of my livestock. Here is this formal presentation. This would have been a formal court ceremony where they bring these 5. Now, why only 5? Well, Joseph probably didn't see a need to drag all 11 of them in to meet with Pharaoh. And so he selects these 5 as representatives to come in to represent the entire family so that they can be presented to Pharaoh and present their case to him. We should understand this was in no way a surprise to Pharaoh. Pharaoh has been kept informed by Joseph everything that's going on, and we should understand this as being just a formality. This is probably good thinking on Joseph's part, because by doing this in a very public way, in a very open way, he avoids any appearance of sort of double dealing or back dealing, or of acting without Pharaoh's authority or anything like that. No one can accuse him later on of, oh, you're not acting in Pharaoh's best interest, because obviously Pharaoh is approving of everything that's being done here. It is just a confirmation of what's already been decided, and doing so in a public way so as to, again, be able to divert any kind of political ramifications away from Joseph and his family. And yet, once again, we see Pharaoh expanding on the decision. He's already agreed. Yes, let's bring them into Goshen. That's already, we'll set them up there in that land. They can have the best of the land. And if we notice what he says here in verse 6, he says, if you know any capable men among them, let them be put in charge of my livestock. So we see him even expanding on the decision in that way, as a form of recognition of the capability of these men, and especially of the capability of Joseph and his family in doing that. He's already obviously confident of Joseph. Maybe Joseph's family can help him even further. And so they kind of expand on the role, if you will. Verse 7 says, then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many years have you lived? So Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have I attained the years that my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and he went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had ordered. And Joseph provided his father and his brothers and his father's household with food according to their little ones. It is interesting that here we find Jacob is blessing Pharaoh. This is perhaps a recognition of Jacob's role as the patriarch of the family. It is also a recognition perhaps of Joseph's role, or Jacob's role and relationship with God. We read, of course, from Hebrews, if we recall back from Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 7. Back in this is, of course, the account where Abraham meets up with Melchizedek, the priest of Salem. And if you recall there, it was Melchizedek who gave the blessing to Abraham. And Paul, I believe the author here of Hebrews, comments on that and says, but without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater. And yet here we have Jacob blessing Pharaoh, suggesting that in this hierarchy, in God's hierarchy, Jacob is of a higher rank than is Pharaoh. Even though Pharaoh is king over Egypt and Jacob is head over this family, the hierarchy suggests that Jacob has the more preeminent role, the more preeminent position than did Pharaoh. And so we see that that's the way the blessing goes. Jacob, as he describes his life, he sees it as a sojourn or a pilgrimage that we see there, as he describes there in verse 9. He recognizes that they have been journeying, but he has not yet attained to the journey. He is still traveling, still waiting. He's, of course, been promised. He was promised that land there in Canaan, he and his descendants, but he hasn't received it, and he knows he won't receive it. He knows it will be given to his descendants far into the future. He knows that. But notice how he describes it. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life. Well, few and unpleasant as he describes it, and in what way? Well, part of it's been because of his own doing. We think back on what we remember reading about Jacob and some of the problems that he brought upon himself with some of his behaviors, and then we also see that some of the unpleasantness has been due to the actions of his sons. Instead of they've lied to him. They lied to him about Joseph. They've put him in a lot of distress over a lot of different circumstances. So we see a lot of Joseph, or Jacob rather, as he describes his life. He describes it, boy, it's been a tough life. And well, a lot of that toughness, Jacob, was your own doing. Between you and your sons, it's been your own doing. And so it's been kind of, it's interesting, though, to see him describe it that way. Some of the Bible critics, some of the Bible folks that like to criticize the Bible, they try to pounce on this. It says Joseph settled his father and his brothers, and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses. Well, this land of Ramses didn't probably exist at the time when Jacob moved in there. This would have been a designation after the children of Israel would have built up this area. They would have built the city of Ramses, and it would have been a reference point then when he wrote the book. And so the critics try and seize on this and say, oh, look, see, Moses made a mistake. It wasn't the land of Ramses. Well, and so he's just simply using a contemporary marker so that the children of Israel will know what he's talking about when he writes about it, even though that this land would have been probably open land, pasture land, at the time when Jacob initially brought his family into this area. And we will see how, of course, we understand the story that ultimately, of course, they will come to thrive. And yes, they will build these cities, and they will set up all this infrastructure, all this area. Now there was no food in the land because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which were bought, and Joseph brought the money unto Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die in your presence? For our money is gone." Then Joseph said, "And I will give you." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys, and he fed them with food in exchange for all the livestock that year. And it came that, and when the year had ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left for my lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Both buy us and our land for food, and we our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and the land may not be destitute." It is just as Pharaoh has dreamed and as Joseph has interpreted, that this famine is going on for 7 years. We find these phases then of the famine as it takes place. Of course, in the early years, they begin to see the famine. They're coming in. They're bringing money to buy food. They're doing that for at least a couple of years. They're coming in to buy food. And so when all the money is exhausted, then they say, "All right, well, we're out of money. What else can we give you in exchange for food?" And so then they come in with their life. As we see here in verses 16 and 17. This is, by the way, in verse 17, the first place that horses are mentioned in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, sorry. In the Old Testament, this is the first place in the Bible where horses are mentioned as livestock. And of course, over time, Egypt will become one of the major producers and deployers of horses, especially horses in warfare. It is the Egyptian chariot will become a fairly breakthrough weapon of war. But this is again the first use of horses in the Old Testament, and the first identification of them as a domesticated animal and as a source of wealth, as a source of value to these people. That these folks are using horses to as weapons of war, for one thing, but also as beasts of burden. We see what they do. They spend all their money. All the money is expended. They trade all their livestock. All the livestock is expended, and then they end up selling all their land and ultimately themselves. This was for this culture, and at this time, this was the security. This was the social security system of its day. This was the welfare system of its day, where folks would, if they reached a certain financial situation, a certain a degree of famine, degree of poverty, they would sell their land, and then ultimately they would sell themselves into a bondage. This was not a permanent slavery. This was usually a temporary condition, but it did have the effect of making the one to whom you were sold, that person is for feeding themselves to Pharaoh, kind of ultimately selling themselves to Joseph. They are putting themselves at Joseph's disposal as he will want to use them, but they're also making Joseph responsible for feeding them. And so that's what they do. They sell their land. They become workers on the land at this point and can continue on in this condition now. In verse 20 then, now all the land of the Egyptians sold his field because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he moved them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh had given them. Therefore they did not sell their land. People, behold, I have today bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you that you may sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own for seed for the field, and for your food, and for those of your households, and as food for your little ones. So they said, you have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves. And Joseph made it a statute according to the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth, only the land of the from Pharaoh's organization in place. We see him, he has a plan. He has this figured out. Once these folks have sold the land, once they have agreed to be workers on the land for Pharaoh, he begins to organize them. First of all, we notice he brings them all into the cities. Well, why? Well, if you're going to have see if they're all in one place. And so he's going to bring them into the cities where they can be organized to work, and they can be grouped up, and they can be assigned to work. We see that the priests are exempt from this arrangement. The priests get to keep their land, and they get to keep an allotment from Pharaoh. Some scholars have suggested that the wording here is such that it may have been that Joseph was not agreeing to this particular arrangement, but got overruled by Pharaoh. That is entirely possible. That he did not want to exempt the priests, but apparently they were. Then we find out that Joseph is going to lay a tax on them. It's a 20% tax. He's got to give a fifth of everything to Pharaoh of what they grow, and they get to keep the remaining 4/5. This is actually a very generous arrangement. A lot of other work that has been done in that Mediterranean area of this time and later times suggests that a person who was in this arrangement, kind of a worker of the land, but you didn't own the land. If you worked the land but you didn't own the land, then you owed to the one who did own the land, you owed them half to 3/4 of the produce of the land. And to collect only 20% was extremely generous. And in fact, even in our own day, I would be entirely happy if our government only collected 20% of my income for its taxes. So it was, again, a very generous plan here on the part of Pharaoh, of Joseph, that only 1/5 of what they were going to collect. We see here too, this is the coming of the end of the famine, because now they are asking for seed to sow. And so that suggests that as we talked about last week, you recall the weather patterns in this area, they rely on that early rain and the late rain. And the early rain comes, like I said, about the time of October, November. Those are the early rains, and that's when they do their plowing. They do their plowing and they do their sowing at that time. And then they have the later rain, which comes around March or thereabouts, March or April, as the grain is starting to head. And it's those later rains then that help bring the yield from the crop. And so the fact that they are asking for, as they say here in verse 23, here is seed for you that you may sow the land, says Joseph. It suggests that now finally the weather pattern has broken. The drought is over. They're starting to get that early rain as expected, and they are going to be able to plow the land and begin to sow it as they had intended. Yeah, this is at the end of July. Yeah, this is at the end of. Yeah, it's 7 years. The 7 years have come to an end, and now it's time to go back to normal, what they would consider normal weather patterns. As we see here then, and they said, you have saved our lives. And in a real sense, yes, Joseph had saved their lives. It was he who had come up with the plan to gather up the grain. It was he who had come up with the plan to store the grain in these cities. It was he who had come up with a plan to disperse that grain back out. And so in a very real sense, by his understanding of God's prophecy, he had stored that food. He had then been prepared to redistribute it back out to the people as they had need. and he had saved not only the Egyptians, but also the Canaanites around this area. As we had suggested before in this study, this drought may have extended throughout most of the Mediterranean and even as far east as India and China, as far as creating a famine in this area. And so all of these nations now, all of these peoples have been saved because of Joseph's understanding of prophecy and also by his administrative skills. Right. Yeah. Yeah, he didn't buy up. Yeah, we don't see him buying up and keeping a lot of this for his own good. It was all done, as it says here, it was all done for Pharaoh. And so he did it all for the leadership that he was under. And so he was, not only was he a very competent and able administrator, but he was also apparently a very honest man who was really trying to do what was best for the people around him. All right, we conclude in this chapter 27, or verse 27. Now Israel lived in the land, lived in the land of Egypt in Goshen, and they acquired property in it and were fruitful and became very numerous. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When the time for Israel to die drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "Please, if I have found favor in your sight, place now your hand under my thigh and deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Please do not bury me in Egypt. When I lie down with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place." And he said, "I will do as you have said." And he said, "Swear to me." So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed his head bowed in worship at the head of the bed. We might understand if Jacob had brought his family now into the land of Goshen. If he has come in with some maybe roughly 100 people, even in 17 years with a very modest growth rate, that family would have been over 200 people at the time of his death. So he's already should have already seen some growth in his family. But he bears witness. He bears witness to God, his faith in God, because he instructs Joseph, "Don't bury me here. You take me back to the land of my fathers." He wants to be buried in that cave of Machpelah, where he has buried his father and his grandfather. Abraham is buried there. Isaac is buried there. He wants to be buried there as well. Why? Why do you think? That's right. That is part of the promise of the land that he's been given him, and he is showing, or perhaps he is demonstrating his faithfulness in the promise of God, in that he is asking for that, for his body to be interred there, knowing that that family is to repossess that land at some point in the future. It is a measure of faith. He is looking forward to, in faith, looking forward to that time when he will be, when that family will again own that land and will own that cave where he and his fathers are buried. We see here in verse 31, then Israel bowed in worship at the head of the bed. If we compare that, some try and criticize the Bible for being, look, it's inconsistent. If we turn and look at the book of Hebrews, for example, we look at the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, and verse 21, says, "By faith Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on top of his staff." Now, verse 31 says he was in his bed, but here he's on the top of his staff. What happened? Well, it's actually not terribly mysterious here. There are two words here that are in play. One is the Hebrew word for bed, and the other one is the Hebrew word for staff. Well, the Hebrew word for bed and the Hebrew word for staff are very similar to one another. Very similar to one another. And it is thought that at some point there might have been some sort of a scribal error, a little slip of the pen or something like that, because the Hebrew version, or the version we have out of the book of Hebrews, it comes through it is a quote out of the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, whereas the version that we have in Genesis is out of the Hebrew translation. And so here you have the difference between the Greek version, kind of a Greek translation, and the Hebrew. And so what we have probably here is nothing more than a slip of pen on this part of the writer. Others have suggested, though, that in fact that Joseph may have been in bed, but have kind of raised himself up and been kind of leaning on his staff as a way of helping him raise up out of bed. And so that may have been also a perfectly valid explanation for what's going on here. But there is no conflict here between these texts. There is no discrepancy. Just either just the different ways of describing the same event, or perhaps just a slight slip in the translation of a word. In any event, it has no bearing on the events as they will unfold. All right, any question or comment about chapter 47? And we'll proceed then into chapter 48. It says, now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, behold, your father is sick. Well, after which things? Well, we should understand here, the chronology here is not, we're not in a rigid chronology here. We're not talking about these things are this discussion that Joseph has with Israel, but rather may have been all of these events from chapter 47 as being described, where Joseph, of course, is administering the distribution of grain and so forth after these events. So in other words, sort of after after the famine is over, after the 7 years of famine have come to an end, after these events, now is the time when death is approaching for Jacob. It says, behold, your father is sick. So he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. All right, Manasseh and Ephraim, about at this time, they are probably in their 20s. They would have been, in their early to mid 20s at about this time. They are grown men as they are coming in to meet their grandfather. And when it was told to Jacob, verse 2, behold, your son Joseph has come to you. Israel collected his strength and sat up in the bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. Well, we studied that. We remember when he came there, he renamed that land as Bethel. But here he identifies it by its earlier name, that of Luz. And he said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a company of peoples and give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. Now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. Now it's interesting that he puts Manasseh and Simeon on a plane equal to the first two born sons of his own sons. Reuben, of course, was the firstborn, then Simeon, and yet here is Jacob, who is elevating them, these two boys, these two young men, Manasseh and Ephraim, and he's elevating them to a status equal to that of his own firstborn sons. And of course, we understand why. We will recall Reuben has disgraced himself with his father by committing adultery with his father's concubine, and so he's angry for that reason. And then Simeon has disgraced himself with his father by being a leader of the attack against the Shechemites and creating that problem back in the time when they're living in that Bethel area, that Simeon has created this conflict with the neighbors in defiance of Jacob's will. And so it's interesting now that we see he gives that preeminence to Joseph by giving Joseph's two sons an equal share among the brothers. And in effect, he's giving Joseph the double portion that would go to the firstborn. As he says here in verse, go on to verse 6. He says, but your offspring that have been born after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of their brothers in their inheritance. So it's only these two brothers that are going to be incorporated into Jacob's inheritance. The rest of Joseph's sons will be according to inheritance according to Joseph's desire. He says, now as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died to my sorrow in the land of Canaan on the journey when I was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Why bring up Rachel at this time? Why mention Rachel? And some of the Bible scholars looking at this are suggesting that this has been, of course, part of Joseph's or Jacob's thinking and intention for some time. That in his mind, his first wife, was always Rachel. She was the first one he chose. That was the one he intended to marry. He ended up marrying Leah, of course, due to deception. And so he married Leah. Then he married Rachel. Then, of course, he was given their Bilhah and can't think of the other one off the top of my head. But anyway, he's given their two servants as concubines. But in the end, always it was Rachel. It was always Rachel was his favorite. It was always her that he saw as being, genuinely his wife, because that was the one he had genuinely chosen to be his wife. And all the rest were sort of almost accidental, if you will, if you want to put it that way. Yeah, Rick? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's an interesting thought. That's an interesting view. And that could be a point that, yes, this may have been some way of Jacob to have as you say, cleared the slate with Joseph, knowing that Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers, knowing that Joseph had endured many years of harsh treatment, as a prisoner in the prison there, and had lived as a slave for several years until he, of course, had finally been elevated by Pharaoh. But you're right. There may have been a little bit of that dig against the brothers who had sold him into slavery, and this was maybe, as you point out, maybe Jacob's way of getting a little bit of retribution back for Joseph, who obviously Joseph isn't interested in taking retribution himself. Joseph, of course, is doing very well, obviously, and has no thought about revenge. But maybe Joseph is giving him just a little taste of revenge, just for that way. But again, others point to the fact that because he mentions Rachel here, that it is in that sense that he is reminding them that always he had thought of Rachel as being his wife, more so than any of the other women that ultimately were his wives. But she was of that four, that was the only one he had actually picked out himself. Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's an excellent point. And a lot of this, and indeed some of the reading that I did, some of the scholars and some of the commentators point to that as well. That Jacob, in fact, had hoped to have had more children with Rachel, especially more sons with Rachel, and because her life was cut short at her death upon giving birth to Benjamin, that as Rita suggests, that this was a way of compensating both himself and her for her loss, for losing her in childbirth to Benjamin. That's a very good point. And yeah, some of the other commentators, as I say, make mention of that. Yes, yeah, she would have been the direct grandmother of these two boys. So that's also a good point. Verse 8, when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he says, who are these? And Joseph said to his father, they are my sons, whom God has given them to me. So he said, bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim from age, so he could not see. Then Joseph brought them close to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your children as well. Notice the use of the word see here. This is kind of we understand. Here is Jacob, who can no longer see, and yet he speaks idiomatically. We understand that it's idiomatically about being able to see Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. He can see them. He can touch them. He can be aware of their presence. Then Joseph took them from his knees and bowed with his face to the ground. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right, and he brought them close. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, crossing his hands, though Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and may my name live on in them, and the names of my father Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Here we see Joseph giving these boys a blessing. He knows what he's doing. He knows which boy is which. Here is Manasseh presented to him so that Manasseh would have been on his right hand, and Ephraim on his left, with Manasseh to receive sort of the primary blessing, if you will, being at the right hand as the firstborn son. And yet Jacob deliberately crosses his hands, crosses his arms, and puts his right hand on top of Ephraim's head and his left hand on top of Manasseh's head. And he does that on purpose. We see that is deliberate. There's a deliberate reasoning for that. And of course, we'll see in just a bit that this is not pleasing to Joseph, but Jacob has a reason for it. He gives these boys a blessing. He points out, I've been a shepherd all my life, but I have continued to live before God. And he prays essentially a prayer for a blessing on these boys. That they will grow up, and that in their name, through them, the names of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be remembered. And of course, that's exactly what happened. We see something of the nature of Joseph, though. He bows down. He bows down before his father. Here in verse 12. He took them from his knees. Some of the translations say they took him from between his knees. Again, kind of a poor translation. It was really not between his knees. That suggests like they were little boys. No, these are grown men. These are men in their 20s. He didn't take him from between his knees. He took them from near his knees. They would have been close by him, and they would have all been kneeling, and he would have presented them to his father that way. Verse 17, then we go on then, in verse 17. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on Ephraim's head, it displeased him, and he grasped his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know, but he shall, and he also shall become a people, and shall be great. However, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. And he blessed him that day, saying, may you, by you, Israel shall pronounce blessing, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am about to die, but God be with you, and bring you back to the land of your fathers. And I will give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. Again, he knows what he's doing. He's wanting to give that blessing to Manasseh, because Manasseh Ephraim rather, is going to have the preeminence. And in fact, we see that down then through Hebrew history, through the children of Israel in their history. The tribe of Ephraim will become one of the predominant, or the predominant tribe in the nation of Israel. This has been pointed out by some of the scholars, the fourth generation, where one of the younger sons has supplanted one of the older ones. You know, with Abraham, it was between Isaac and Ishmael, and it was Isaac was the chosen one, not Ishmael. Between Jacob and Esau, Isaac's sons, it was Jacob rather than Esau, the firstborn. And then between the sons of Jacob, it was Joseph who was preferred, or even Judah rather than Reuben, the firstborn. And now here's the fourth time. Here's Manasseh and Ephraim, and we find Ephraim, even though he's younger, Ephraim is gets the preeminence. Finally, we're left with this kind of curious statement too. He says, I will give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. This is the land around Shechem. This was this land that was identified as being from around Shechem. We're not sure what it means when Jacob says, I took this with my sword and my bow. There may have been some kind of a fight, some kind of a conquest of this land. Perhaps the Amorites took the land away. This was land that Jacob, by the way, had already purchased. Some commentators speculate that these Amorites had moved in. They had claimed the land for their own, and that Jacob had to go back and retake it by force. Exactly what's going on, or that other commentators suggest he may be looking forward to a time when his descendants, the children of Israel, will take this land by force, and that land then would become to the portion of Joseph. All right, I'm going to stop there. We'll continue on chapters 49 and 50 next week. Let's be thinking again about what do you want to study after this. I got a couple of ideas myself, one or two in the Old Testament, one or two in the New Testament, and would be interested in what you think. Appreciate your comments and attention this morning.